cold tastes like iron and abandonment. That was what Lena discovered in the first winter, after her husband left, not with a fight, not with a goodbye, but with a note tucked under the sugar tin and a set of empty boot tracks leading east toward the Crow's Nest Pass. She had stayed. That was the part nobody in town understood. 3 years in the Kootenay highlands, a homestead that sat at the end of a logging trail, so overgrown the spruce had nearly swallowed it whole, and she had stayed. Not out of stubbornness, though she had plenty. Not out of hope, though she had buried most of that under the frost heaves in the root cellar. She had stayed because the land was hers, in a way that the man never had been, and because leaving felt like admitting that the cold had won. She was splitting kindling when the truck came. The sound reached her before the headlights did, the crunch of gravel under slow tires. Deliberate and unhurried, the kind of approach that meant someone already knew you were home. Lena set the hatchet down across the chopping block. She wiped her palm on the thigh of her work pants and stood straight, letting her eyes adjust to the late October dusk pooling between the firs. Her heart moved up into her throat, quiet and animal. 2 vehicles, a rusted pickup and a dark SUV with a cracked front bumper. They rolled to a stop at the edge of the clearing, not quite in the yard, and 3 men climbed out. She didn't recognize them. That was the first bad sign. Everyone who had business at the end of this road was someone she recognized. The man in front was thick-necked and wore a hunting vest over a flannel shirt. He carried himself with the particular ease of someone who had never been told no by a woman and didn't expect to start now. The 2 behind him were younger, rangier. One of them kept looking at the truck, then at the tree line, like he was calculating exits. Lena didn't move toward the door. Running showed fear, and fear out here was a kind of invitation. "Can I help you?" she said. It wasn't a question. The man in the vest smiled. It didn't reach his eye. "We're just looking for a place to bed down for the night. Road washed out below Harkin Creek. Saw your light." She knew the road hadn't washed out. She'd driven it 2 days ago, and the ground was still iron-hard with the season's first freeze. But she kept her face flat. "There's a lodge in Fernie." 20 minutes south, he took a step forward. "Now see, that's a long drive in the dark, and you've got that big barn there. Wouldn't take much, just a corner out of the wind." She read the geometry of it quickly, Vestman talking to keep her attention front. The rangy one on her left drifting wide, the third hanging back by the truck with his hands in his pockets. She broke for the porch. She made it up the 2 steps before the rangy one caught her arm. She spun, driving her elbow backward the way her father had taught her, and felt it connect with something solid. Nose or cheekbone. She didn't stop to check. He swore and grabbed her by the collar of her jacket. She clawed at the wood of the door frame, her fingers finding the edge, her boots scrabbling on the frost-slick boards. The door didn't hold. The latch was old, and she'd been meaning to replace it since August. She went down hard inside the threshold, her palms catching on the rough-hewn floor. The smell of pine pitch and cold ash filled her nose. She rolled, reaching for the utility shelf just inside the door, the heavy maglite, the bear spray she kept clipped to the bracket. Her fingers closed around the cold cylinder. She got one good blast before Vestman grabbed her wrist. The spray caught the rangy one full in the face. He screamed. It was a thin, high sound, and she felt something vicious and clear-headed rise in her chest at the sound of it. But Vestman had her arm bent up behind her back, and the third one, the quiet one, the one she'd nearly forgotten about, was in the doorway now, filling it. "Hold still." Vestman breathed against her ear. The pressure on her arm was immense, grinding. She pressed her cheek against the cold floor and bit the inside of her own mouth to keep from crying out. She could hear the rangy one, still swearing near the door, pawing at his eyes. She could hear the wind off the mountain, steady and indifferent. She could feel the cold coming up through the floorboards and the heat of her own blood hammering in her temples, and she thought, very clearly, "Nobody knows I'm here." That was the worst of it. Not the pain, not the fear. The absolute, total certainty that she could scream until the rafters shook, and the only answer would be the trees. Then the door exploded inward, not kicked, lifted entirely off its hinges. The old pine frame gave like cardboard, and the door sailed 2 feet into the room and hit the floor with a concussive slam that shook the whole cabin. Vestman flinched. The grip on Lena's arm loosened for half a second. Enough. She twisted free and rolled toward the stove. The man in the doorway was enormous, not tall in a lanky way. Massive, the way old-growth timber is massive, weight and density, and the quiet certainty that nothing was going to move him unless he decided to move. He wore a canvas work jacket so weathered it had gone grey, and a wool toque pulled low over dark hair that hadn't been cut in a season or 2. His hands were bare despite the cold, and they were the kind of hands that had been broken and broken again. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Vestman went for the knife at his belt. The big man crossed the room in 2 strides and caught the wrist before the blade cleared the sheath. What followed wasn't a fight in any recognizable sense. It was brief. It was quiet. It was the way a very large, very calm person dismantles a threat the way you'd pull a nail out of wood. Not with anger, just with the right amount of force applied to exactly the right place. Vestman went down hard against the kitchen table. The table broke. He didn't get up. The quiet one from the doorway ran, just turned and ran back out into the dark, and Lena heard the SUV start and the gravel spray as it reversed out of the clearing. The rangy one was still half blind from the spray. He stumbled toward the open door frame. The big man looked at him once, a long, flat look, and the rangy one stumbled faster, colliding with the door frame on his way out, and then the sound of running footsteps faded into the dark spruce. Silence. Lena was on her knees beside the iron stove, her right shoulder aching in a way that suggested something torn rather than bruised, the bare spray canister still clutched in her left hand. The big man stood in the wreckage of her door frame, his chest rising and falling with barely any more exertion than a man who'd just climbed a staircase. He looked at the open doorway. He looked at her. He didn't reach for her. He didn't rush over with outstretched hands and reassurances. He just looked at her the way you look at someone who has been through something, checking for damage without making it a performance. "Get up," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, with the particular flatness of a man who had spent most of his years talking only to himself. Cold air coming in. She stood up. It took 2 tries. She kept the bare spray in her hand. "Who are you?" she said. He looked at the broken door, then back at her. "Evander." He said it the way you state a fact. No apology for the unusual name, no explanation, just the word. She stared at him. "I'm Lena." He nodded once. He turned to the door frame and crouched, examining the broken hinges with his bare hands. His knuckles were scarred, the skin over them thick and pale. "You have screws?" he asked. She blinked. In the coffee tin on the shelf. She watched him find the tin, sort through it with 2 fingers, select the right gauge without hesitation. He picked up the door, which weighed at least 70 pounds, and held it in place one-handed while he worked the first screw in with a flat head he'd found in the tin without being asked. She found herself talking because the silence was starting to feel like pressure. Were you walking out there? It's nearly dark." "Trapline," he said. "Through the drainage above you." She hadn't known anyone worked the drainage above her property. She'd thought that was crown land, too steep and too dense for anything but goats and the odd wolverine. "You work it alone?" she asked. He glanced back at her. Yes, she cleaned her palms on a dish towel. They were bleeding in 3 places from the floor. She crossed to the kitchen and poured 2 inches of rye into a tin cup, the cheap stuff she kept for cooking, and she poured a second one, set it on the table without a word, and sat down in the chair closest to the stove. Evander finished the hinges. He tested the door twice, opening and closing it, checking the swing. He dragged the broken table aside with one hand. He picked up Vestman, who was beginning to stir, blinking, by the collar. and walked him to the door and dropped him on the porch steps. He said something to him, too quietly for Lena to hear, and the man didn't argue. He just crawled off the porch and stumbled across the yard toward the pickup. They listened to the truck leave. Evander came back inside. He saw the second tin cup. He stood at the table for a moment, then sat down across from her. His size made the chair look like something borrowed from a child's room. He looked at the rye and picked it up and drank it in one movement without comment. "You don't have to stay," Lena said. She said it on reflex, the same reflex that had made her lie to her sister for 2 years about how fine she was out here. He set the cup down. He didn't say anything. She looked at her hands. A thin line of blood was tracking down the inside of her wrist from one of the scrapes. She pressed the dish towel against it. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "The man on the porch." Evander looked at the door. "I told him if I see him on this side of the Elk River Valley again, he'll leave something behind him, that he won't grow back." She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you mean that?" He met her eyes. The irises were a particular shade of grey-brown, the colour of creek water over granite in March, and they held the same quality as creek water, still on the surface, moving hard underneath. "Yes," he said. She believed him. She didn't entirely understand why, but she did. He slept in the barn. She didn't ask him to. She'd been working herself up to telling him the night was fine. She was fine. There was a lodge in Fernie he could reach before full dark. She never quite got there. He stood up, said he'd be close by, and walked out to the barn with the same matter-of-fact efficiency with which he'd repaired her door. She watched from the window as the barn light flickered on and went steady. She didn't sleep. She sat in the rocker by the stove, with her father's 30-30 across her knees, and listened to the wind work through the stovepipe and the distant sound of a great horned owl somewhere up the drainage, and underneath both of those sounds, at intervals, the faint shift of movement in the barn. Not threatening, just present. It was the most bizarre comfort she had felt in 3 years. Morning came grey and mean, the temperature dropping hard overnight, the yard glazed with black ice that caught what little light made it through the cloud cover. Lena's shoulder had stiffened badly in the night. She could lift the arm, but only to about chest height, before the pain went white and specific. She had a cord of wood to split, a water line to check, 2 hens that had stopped laying and needed to be assessed, a list of small critical tasks that amounted to survival, and a right shoulder that had been wrenched at an angle it was not built for. She was standing in the yard in her rubber boots, trying to determine whether she could grip the hatchet when the barn door opened. Evander came out without a coat. He wore the same wool shirt from the night before, and the cold didn't appear to be affecting him in any measurable way. He looked at her standing there with the hatchet and her expression, and the way she was holding her right arm slightly away from her body, and he looked at the woodpile, and he came and took the hatchet from her without asking. "I can do it," she said. He set the hatchet down and picked up the splitting maul instead. He looked at her. "You can tell me where you want. The wood stacked." She wanted to argue. She had an entire argument prepared, the one she'd given her sister and her mother and the well-meaning couple from the next property, over who kept suggesting she move to town. But the argument felt exhausted, and her shoulder was telling her very clearly what it thought of her independence this morning. "Against the east wall of the porch," she said. "Out of the wind." He nodded and went to work. She watched him for a moment. He split wood the way he did everything. Quiet, efficient, zero wasted motion. The maul rose and fell in a clean arc. He wasn't showing off. He just happened to be very good at it. She went inside and put the kettle on and came back out with 2 cups of coffee, black, because she was out of cream and had been for a week. She set one on the porch rail. He picked it up between sets without breaking his rhythm. He didn't say thank you. She didn't require it. That was how the days went. He didn't announce that he was staying. He just didn't leave. She didn't ask him to leave. Some negotiation happened in the space between those 2 facts. conducted entirely without words, and by the end of the first week she had stopped bracing every time she heard his boots on the porch. By the end of the second week she had stopped measuring the distance to the point C to 30 every time he came inside. He was working his trap line most mornings, gone before first light and back by early afternoon. He brought things, a brace of snowshoe hair, a section of stovepipe, flashing to replace the one she'd been meaning to fix since September. He'd found where the frost was heaving the foundation on the north corner and spent a full afternoon repacking the gravel without being asked and without mentioning it afterward. He slept in the barn every night. She never asked him to come in, and he never suggested it. She learned things about him in fragments, the way you learn. The shape of a landscape in poor light. One detail at a time, none of them quite adding up to a whole picture yet. He'd been in the mountains since his early 30s. Before that, she gathered from the few things he said, something in the north. Fort McMurray, she thought. Industrial work, something that had paid well and cost more. He didn't have a phone. He'd had one once. He didn't anymore. She told him about her husband on a Tuesday evening, not intending to, just because they were sitting at the opposite ends of the table, after a dinner of hare stew, and the silence had gotten comfortable enough that she stopped monitoring what she said. He left in January, she said. There was a note. Evander was cleaning his hunting knife with a strip of cloth. He didn't look up. What did it say? That he wasn't built for this? She paused. The wind pushed at the window. It turned out he was built for a woman in Lethbridge with a townhouse and a parking spot, so I guess that part was true. Evander ran his thumb along the flat of the blade, checked the edge, set it down. He was wrong about you, he said. She looked at him. He met her eyes briefly, then looked back at the table. A man who builds himself an exit before winter comes doesn't get to have an opinion about who you are. She didn't say anything for a long moment. How do you know that? She finally said. He looked at the door. The new door, rehung straight, the latch replaced with a heavier one he'd picked up in town on a supply run without mentioning he was going to. Because you're still here, he said. She looked at her hands around her coffee cup. She didn't trust her voice for a minute. The third week, he came back from the trap line early. She knew before he was across the yard that something was wrong. It wasn't urgency in his face. She'd never seen urgency in his face. It was the particular stillness of a man who has assessed a situation and is already 3 steps ahead in his response. He came inside and said, quietly, "There are tracks above the tree line. 2 sets. They came down to the fence line and turned back. She felt it in her sternum before she understood it. The same animal knowledge that had put her skin up the evening the 3 men came. The pickup, she said. He nodded. They came back to look, confirming the lay of the land. She sat down. Evander stood at the window, looking out at the mountain. In the flat grey November light, he was very still. She watched him think, watched the quality of his attention shift, the way it did when he was working out a problem. I'm going to Fernie tomorrow, he said. There are people there I can ask. She thought about telling him she didn't need him to do that. The words were right there. The old words, the ones she'd been saying since January 3 years ago. She didn't say them. What kind of people? She asked instead. He looked at her, the kind who know who drives a dark SUV with a cracked bumper and who they work for. He left before dawn. He took his truck, a 10-year-old Tacoma that she'd assumed had been parked on the far side of the barn and which apparently ran fine. He left his lever action, .3006, standing in the corner by her kitchen door. He didn't make a speech about it. He just left it there. She understood. She spent the day the way she spent every day. Water, wood, animals, food. But the rhythm felt different. Not empty the way it had for 3 years. More like the feeling before a front moves in, the particular alertness of a landscape waiting for weather. She found herself doing something she hadn't done in a long time. She baked bread. Not because she needed to, because the smell of it would fill the cabin by the time he got back. and she wanted the cabin to smell like something other than cold and solitude. She burned the edges of the first loaf. She didn't burn the second one. He came back on the evening of the second day, later than she'd expected, later than was comfortable. She heard the Tacoma before she saw the headlights. She was at the window before she realized she'd stood up. He came in with a cold that had settled into his jacket, the smell of road and coffee, and the peculiar dry cold of the Alberta highway on him. He sat down at the table. He looked tired, which was the first time she'd seen him look tired. Vestman's name was Harlan Briggs. He worked for a man out of Calgary, who acquired rural properties through means that stopped just short of legal, and occasionally crossed that line when people didn't move fast enough. The dark SUV belonged to a man named Toes, who had 2 outstanding civil judgments and a sealed record from 2019 that her Fernie contact had seen once and wouldn't describe. "They know who I am now," she said. Evander poured himself water from the pitcher and drank it. He set the glass down. "They knew who you were before," he said. "That's why they came. The land," she said, "the timber rights on the upper drainage." He nodded. She'd known, on some level, that this was coming. The letters had started 2 summers ago from a numbered company with a Calgary address. She'd thrown 3 of them away. Then a man had come in a nice truck to tell her what a fair price for the property would be, and she'd told him to drive back the way he came. And then in October, Harlan Briggs had shown up with 2 men and a dark SUV at the end of her road. "They're going to come back with more," she said. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he raised his eyes. "Yes," he said. She let that sit. "What happens," she asked, "when someone won't leave?" He didn't look away. "Sometimes nothing," he said. "Sometimes they find out that the cost of taking something is higher than the value of the thing." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. She could feel the heat coming off the iron stove across the room. Outside, the mountain pressed its weight against the dark. "What do we do?" she said. And she heard the word as she said it. We. She hadn't used that word about herself in 3 years. Evander heard it too. She could tell from the fractional change in his expression. Not quite a shift, more like a steadying. "We get ahead of it," he said. "I know people with the land title office, and a lawyer in Cranbrook who works land disputes. If there's any irregularity in the original survey, we find it." "You've done this before," she said. His jaw moved. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent. "I've been on the other side of it," he said. She looked at him, waiting. He set his hands flat on the table. The scars on his knuckles caught the lamplight. 10 years ago I had land in the Peace River country. Good land, spruce and a creek, and enough light in the summers to grow feed. He paused. A company out of Edmonton wanted the rights to what was underneath. When I said no, they made my life very small for about a year. What happened? I left, he said. His voice was entirely even. I was younger. I thought leaving was protecting what I had left to protect. She waited. He looked at her, and the quality in his grey-brown eyes was very clear and very direct. "I'm not leaving this time." The silence in the cabin was different from all the other silences she'd lived in for 3 years. Those silences had been the absence of something. This one had weight, had presence, had the solid mass of a decision already made. She thought about saying something practical. She thought about pointing out that his trapline was not her problem, that his old business from Peace River country was not her business, that he had no stake in this land beyond the 3 weeks he'd spent in her barn. What she actually said was, "I burned the first loaf of bread today." He looked at her. "There's a second one," she said. "It's not burned." He looked at the kitchen shelf, where the loaf sat in its cloth. Something moved very slightly in his face. He didn't come back with anything clever. He just said, "I'll eat the burned one." She looked at the table. Her throat did something complicated. Harlan Briggs came back on a Thursday morning in late November, when the first real snow was still coming down, soft and steady, whitening the spruce boughs and filling in the tire ruts in the yard. He didn't come with 2 men this time. Lena was in the barn checking on the hens when she heard the vehicles. She counted 4 sets of tires on the gravel before she'd cleared the barn door. There were 2 pickup trucks and the dark SUV, and there were more men than she wanted to count, and Harlan Briggs stood in the middle of the yard with his ruined nose. Evander had broken it the first night. She'd learned later, just by moving the man's face in a direction it wasn't meant to go. And he was looking at the cabin like he'd already decided what was inside it no longer belonged to anyone he needed to deal with. He hadn't seen the Tacoma. It was behind the barn, out of sight. Lena stepped out of the barn. She was carrying the 30-30. Harlan Briggs looked at her and smiled, and the smile was the worst thing about him. It was patient. "I'd put that down if I were you," he said. "There's 5 of us, and there's a lot of empty mountain up there." She didn't put it down. From behind Harlan Briggs, from the direction of the trail that came in from above, from the trapline drainage, from the mountain, from the place. She now knew Evander had been watching since before the vehicles turned off the main road. A sound, footsteps on the snow, steady, unhurried. Evander walked into the clearing from the tree line. He was wearing his work jacket and the wool toque, and he had his 36 broken over one arm, and he walked like the cold didn't have jurisdiction over him, like the 5 men with their hands near their belts were a minor inconvenience. He walked until he was standing even with Lena, about 6 feet to her right, and he stopped. He looked at Harlan Briggs. Harlan Briggs's patience flickered. "You've got no authority here," Briggs said. Evander looked at the men behind Briggs. His gaze moved over them with the calm, systematic efficiency of a man reading a situation like a topographic map, identifying terrain, calculating routes, noting where the ground would give. Then he looked at Briggs. "I've got a lawyer in Cranbrook who filed 2 motions this morning," he said. "One with the Land Title Office about the survey irregularity on the drainage parcel. One with the RCMP detachment in Fernie about your visit 3 weeks ago." He paused. "The documentation on the second one is substantial." Briggs's expression moved in several directions at once. "You have no—" "She has witnesses," Evander said. His voice didn't rise. "From the lodge at Harkin Creek. 2 of them who saw your truck on the road that evening." He tilted his head slightly. "How's your nose healing up?" One of the men behind Briggs began to recalculate his position. Lena watched it happen. The man shifted his weight backward just slightly. Then the man beside him did the same. Briggs stood very still for a long moment. His jaw worked. "This land is going to be acquired," he said, "one way or another." Evander looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has been cold and hungry and alone and broken, and has outlasted every version of hard that life offered him, and is therefore genuinely unimpressed by a man in a hunting vest, standing in a snowy yard making threats. "Come back," Evander said quietly, "and we'll see which way." Briggs looked at Lena. He looked at the 30-30. He looked at the men behind him, 2 of whom were now visibly less committed to the morning's agenda than they'd been when they left Calgary. He looked at Evander. He got in his vehicle. The others followed. It took a long time for the sound of the tires to fade completely down the access road, and for another minute after that neither of them moved. The snow kept coming down, patient and indifferent, covering the tire tracks almost as fast as they were made. Lena lowered the rifle. Her hands were entirely steady. That surprised her, and then it didn't. She'd been steady when it counted. She'd learned that about herself 3 weeks ago, on a dirty floor, with her cheek against the boards. And she hadn't forgotten it. She looked at Evander. He was watching the tree line. Old habit. She was starting to understand. He watched the edges of things. It was how he'd survived a long time out here by himself. "The lawyer," she said. He looked at her. "Is there actually a lawyer in Cranbrook?" His mouth moved, the almost smile. "Yes," he said. "I called her on the way back from Fernie." She exhaled slowly. The steam of it hung between them in the cold air, and the witnesses at the lodge. He was quiet for a moment. "There's a woman named Beth who runs the front desk. She has a good memory for vehicles." He paused. And she owes me a favor from a situation involving a black bear and a propane tank 3 summers ago. Lena looked at him. He looked back. She felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not relief, exactly. Not safety, exactly. Something older than both of those. The particular warmth of standing next to someone in the cold and having it be the right person. I should have done the title search 2 years ago, she said. When the first letter came. You didn't have anyone to do it with, he said. Simply, not as absolution, just as fact. She looked at the mountain, her mountain, the drainage above it that somebody in Calgary thought they were going to acquire. One way or another. They'll come back, she said. He came to stand beside her, looking up at the same tree line. Probably, he said, and we'll be here. She didn't look at him. She looked at the snow coming down in the dark spruce, and the tracks the vehicles had left in the yard, and the barn where she'd spent 3 years doing everything alone. And she thought about January 3 years ago, and the note under the sugar tin, and she thought about the first night Evander had walked into her cabin and lifted a 70-pound door with one hand and asked her where she kept the screws. She thought about the burned loaf of bread. Evander, she said. He looked down at her. She didn't say what she'd been going to say. She didn't need to. He was watching her face with the same focused, unhurried attention he gave to everything, and whatever was in her expression was apparently sufficient. He reached out slowly. He didn't put his arm around her. He just rested his hand, briefly, on the back of her shoulder, her injured shoulder, the one that had been wrenched 3 weeks ago. With a gentleness that was somehow more careful than anything she'd been expecting from those scarred, broken-knuckled hands. Come inside, she said, the bread still warm. They walked toward the cabin together. Boots, making twin tracks in the fresh snow, the mountain holding its cold breath above them. The door opened easily on its new hinges, and the warm air and the smell of bread reached out to meet them. And Lena pulled shut behind her with the solid, certain click of a latch that was finally strong enough to hold.